All right, so basically all I did was I cut off using my cutoff wire, right? Roughly a pound of clay, and it started out as this sort of square shape here. First things first, I'm just gonna smack it into what we call like a potato shape, because if you go for round, you'll inevitably end up with a potato, right? That's what Robin's doing right now too. So this is probably a pound and a half. Until you get your feet wet and you're kind of comfortable, I do not recommend throwing more than a pound or a pound and a half. Even up to 2 pounds, you can make like a pretty decent sized bowl with 2 pounds. That's gonna be a lot of clay for you guys to handle when you're just learning, right? If you're ever unsure, we've got a scale here. Oh, I'm actually like at a pound and a quarter, so it's not that much. But roughly like baseball sized is what you wanna shoot for, right? So I've got my bat on my wheel. My wheel is spinning counterclockwise. I'm just gonna take my sponge, squeeze most of the water out of it, and then I'm gonna dampen my wheel. Can you guys see okay via the video? Okay, good deal. I'm gonna slam that down close to the middle, right? And then I'm gonna give it 2 firm smacks. We really want this to be stuck to here. Inevitably, someone's clay will not be stuck proper. They'll put a bunch of pressure on it and it'll shoot over at somebody. So the 2 smacks is a super important part of that, right? To really ensure that it doesn't go anywhere, what I do is I'll take my middle finger and I basically just at an angle, try to seal that to the wheel head. Can you guys see that? Okay, good deal. Now what I'm gonna do, and remember with clay, anytime you touch clay, it should be wet hands, wet clay, right? You always want this to be shiny and your hands to be shiny. You'll notice the more I work on it, and I'm just like leaning into it real quick, right? The more I work on it, eventually it'll lose some of that shine as my hands and the clay absorb water, and it'll start to drag. If you ever notice it starts to go matte like this, you're getting some drag, that means you need some more water. So the easiest way, in my opinion, to remember how to center is your left hand makes a chair, your right hand makes like a karate chop motion, right? You guys will probably be throwing for the most part sitting down. It's really, really important. Anytime you move your hands, think of your hands connected as one tool. So I like to imagine my hands as one of those like, I don't know if you guys have seen of the like robots that build cars in like a Ford factory or something, right? It's just basically like a big claw that moves around, or like an Iron Man, the stuff that like puts a suit on. I think of my hands like that because they're always connected, they're always working in unison, right? So when I do anything, there's always some form of my hands touching because your 2 hands have much more structural stability than 1 hand does, right? So my left hand is gonna come in here and I'm gonna wedge into my like sort of midsection because I'm standing up. If I was sitting down, I would probably wedge into like the crevice where your like leg connects to your upper body, right? But you really need your elbow to be locked in someplace because otherwise if you're doing this, the clay is gonna have a really easy time throwing you around. If I'm locked in, all I have to do is really lean on it and it'll become the shape that I want it to become. So left hand makes a chair. Put that right there. Elbow's locked into my body, right? And I'm just leaning with some downward pressure, but also like kind of forward pressure. And then my right hand comes down on top and karate chops it. This is called centering. If you don't get this step close to right, the rest of it becomes much, much more difficult, right? So you can see, like basically what we're looking for is it not to wiggle anymore, right? If you have wiggle, that wiggle's gonna be there the whole time. And once your pot gets thin, wiggle is what like throws the top off to one side, right? So I'm gonna spend some time doing that. Sometimes it's hard to get clay centered just with the chair karate chop, right? So I'm gonna show you what we call coning. It's also called wheel wedging. It's another way to get rid of clay, or not get rid of clay, get rid of air bubbles in your clay. And it also helps kind of align all your molecules while you're throwing. The way I do that is I come in with that chair, probably, I don't know, 7 o'clock, which is usually where it lives. And for me, it's mostly this part of my, the pad of my hand that's doing a lot of the work. So one hand's gonna go there. I'm gonna cross over my thumb, maybe towards noon. The reason I'm doing that is because if I don't, I end up with like a big sort of volcano valley in there, which I don't want, right? But crossing over my thumb helps keep that shape more pointy on top, which is easier. We get that wet again. Chair hand's gonna be at 7 o'clock. I'm gonna make another chair hand probably at like 1 or 2 o'clock. I'm gonna squeeze those together and rise up with the clay as I do. And anytime you get towards the top of a piece, you're gonna wanna gently ease off on the pressure, right? Same thing when you're pulling up a wall, which we'll do in a little bit. If you do this, like the likelihood of your pot being thrown off center from the like sort of weird suction action of you letting off really quickly will mess you up later, right? So anytime you touch clay, you want to go into it gently, and when you let go, you sort of, I like to imagine it's sort of like a jellyfish, like swimming away from something, right? Where it's like, it's gentle. So I'm going to cone up like this, then I'm going to take my chair hand with my thumb over top, and I'm going to push down and to the right a little bit. I don't know if you guys can see on the camera, but you see how it's kind of leaning over? It's kind of making that like, what's the like hill in Nightmare Before Christmas? It kind of like starts to bend over like that. So it's leaning over, and then it's going to align itself under the pad of my thumb. Did you guys see it? Okay. Once that happens, I switch back to chair karate chop. Basically, all I'm doing is taking all the clay molecules in there that aren't quite lined up, and I'm squeezing them up into a tube shape, and then I'm smashing them back down into the shape that I want them to be. You want like roughly a hockey puck shape. That's the easiest point to start the rest of the steps. Does that make sense to everybody? Again, it's going to be just like an onslaught of information I'm throwing at you. So like most of today will be me and Lum like running around and helping you guys individually do stuff. So like don't sweat it. You'll get it eventually, right? So we're going to go back to our chair karate chop. As far as wheel speed goes too, some people work really, really fast. Some people like to throw working really, really slow. I find somewhere in the middle is like the easiest, best bet, right? When I center, I go a little bit faster than I do the rest of the time. For the most part, also, all these wheels have a like set it and forget it cruise control setting where you can put it where you want it and then take your foot off. Because if you're constantly doing this the whole time you're throwing, it's going to make your life more difficult. So I probably use roughly this medium wheel speed like this, right? You guys can see it's kind of like a lathe. I like to think of a wheel like a vertical lathe. You just want everything to be in the middle so that it's in the middle the rest of the time. You don't see any wiggle, but if I did that, you know what I mean? You can see it's got like a little movement like this to it, right? So I'm just going to spend some time hitting it with that chair karate chop a little longer. You guys will be able to tell. Like they'll be, trust me when I say you'll be able to tell when it's off a little bit. You just want no wiggle. Now what we need to do, that's centering done, is we need to drop the well. The way I like to do that is I make like finger guns, right? I call it finger gun method. And I, at the very top, trace in with my finger guns. And eventually, like right around here, it'll make like a little mound, right? And then if I keep pushing through that mound will become a divot. Right where that divot is the exact center of the piece. The reason I do this is, a lot of people will teach you like, oh, you just go down with like 2 thumbs and that's how you open your piece up, or you use your whole hand. It's very hard to find the exact middle when you do that, and you'll end up with a thick side and a thin side. That thick and thin side will continue up, and you'll end up with one part that's way, way, way taller than the other side, right? And we want, thin pots is always the thing that like people really go for when they're trying to make good pots. Thin pots isn't important. You want a consistent wall thickness. That's how you know a pot is good. Pot can be substantial so long as there's consistent wall thickness. If it's like really thin down here, real thick up here, real thin down here, that's not thrown well. You know what I mean? So that's what we're going to be shooting for, is like a consistent wall thickness throughout. So now that I've got this little divot, it's called dropping the well, right? It also acts as like a little reservoir so I can put water in there so my hands don't drag so bad. I'm going to then take my finger guns down at a 45-degree angle. And remember, anytime my hands are doing something where there's pressure involved, it's 2 hands together, right? Take my finger guns with my other hand bracing, and I'm just going to push down at a 45-degree angle till I get to roughly a 1/4 inch from the wheel head, right? There's an easy way to check that, right? We use our little stabby tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stab in there. I'm going to then trace down the stabby tool with my finger, pull it out, and that's how thick the bottom of my pot is, right? That's roughly what we're searching for, is that 1/4 inch. That's like what like the standard potter thickness is. That way, if you do want to trim, you've got some to trim away, but it's not so thick that you have to trim it, right? Especially on a cup. I'm shooting for a cup today. Kind of everything in pottery starts as a cup, and then we turn it into a different shape, so it's really important to nail cup. Right, so I've got my pottery thickness established at the bottom with my finger guns, right? Then I'm going to take my finger guns and like switch them into gangster mode. I'm going to put them sideways. So then I'm going to, probably with the pad of my middle finger here, I have just like the slightest bit of like clawness to it. And with that claw, I'm going to pull out towards 3 o'clock to widen out the base of my pot, right? A cylinder is like a straight wall, a flat bottom, a straight wall. Inevitably, like what a lot of beginners do is they'll make kind of a rounded inside shape, which is fine. That just means you have a bunch of extra clay in the corners, which we want to avoid. That'll take years to get rid of, right? Like even if you've been throwing for a long time, like people's pots are still heavy in the corners because it's a hard thing to do to get like a flat, straight shape. But like I said before, almost everything we do in pottery revolves around making a cylinder and then turning it into something else. So next step is really important. It's called compression. We really want to like stack those clay molecules, right? There are a bunch of hexagons that are sort of like sitting on top of each other. If we add pressure to it, what it has tendency to do is line them up and lock them in. This will prevent you from getting cracks in the very bottom of your work, right? So I'm just taking a sponge, and with downward pressure, not a ton, because I'm not trying to make that flat part like deeper, but I'm basically just reinforcing the clay down there. You can also use your rib tool for this. I use it with the like rounded corner facing towards my left. And just with not a ton of pressure, but I'm just trying to sort of seal that off and compress that bottom there. If you end up with a bunch of cracks in your pieces, I really recommend using the rib to do this, right? So now we've got that set up.
When you use the rib on the bottom, is it straight up and down or still at a bit of an angle?
This one?
Yeah.
It's pretty straight up and down, but you can pitch it depending on what you need, you know what I mean? So you can sort of wiggle it this way or that way, depending on what you got to do. So now what I'm going to do, I'm trying to think of the easiest way to do this. All right, next step I call it like bird hands, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hands, interlock them like this. I have this really sort of wide, flat shape. To turn it into a cylinder, I really need to start with a volcano shape. If you're shooting for straight up walls, try to throw this, because you'll end up throwing it wider than you want to, and it'll end up straight. If you start by trying to throw this, you'll end up with a bowl, like almost inevitably. Everything I do when I throw a cylinder is a really exaggerated attempt to try to throw a cone shape, because like inevitably, based on the shape of my hands, based on the fact that my head's a little bit to the right of where I'm throwing, you end up doing this when you think you're doing this. Does that make sense? So I'm going to start out by getting it slightly closer to that conical shape. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bird hands, and I'm going to lean forward on the clay. I'm not putting a ton of pressure. This also has a tendency to dry your clay out really, really quickly, so just be mindful of that. And I want to lean into it so that basically the digit where my thumb connects to my palm is the one doing the most pressure, and I'm pushing it into that volcano shape. Does that make sense? All right. Clean out my wheel a little bit. Hey, I'm doing pretty good so far. I'm not covered in clay. Hey! I'm going to mop out some of the water from the inside. If you have like a big pool of water on the inside for a long time, that water is just weakening your clay little bit by little bit the whole time. So there's a lot of like, add a bunch of water to it, do the thing you wanted to do, clean all the water out. You know what I mean? So now that we've got it here, we have to do what, in my opinion, is like one of the trickier parts, right? Which is pulling the wall up into a shape. I do this by starting with a couple of what I call muscle pulls. Now you don't have to use like a gang of pressure when you're doing it, but the first couple pulls, you need a little bit more pressure so you can get all that thick clay from the bottom corner up into the walls. I do that by sort of pinching a sponge between my thumb and my middle finger, and then using my middle finger through the sponge. The sponge is kind of just like a liquid reservoir, because this part has a tendency to really dry your fingers out. My right hand through the sponge goes on this bottom corner here. I'm going to basically make a little shelf there. Can you guys see that? Again, I don't want like a super wet sponge, but I do want some moisture in there. So my bottom right middle finger, right? And then my inside hand is my middle finger as well. And that's at that bottom corner of where you establish the wall. Does that make sense to everybody? So right here. Inevitably what this looks like, because this side is lower than the inside is you're basically squeezing these two things together, and then you're rising up slowly as you're doing it. That's inevitably what you're shooting for. You don't want them to be right on each other, because that means this one's not low enough to the bat, right? They're one slightly under another one. And then I try to pull in towards the center, because that's how I get that cone shape. What that looks like, that's a lot of talking, right? What that looks like is this. Right? Once I get to the top, I ease off on the pressure. There's much more pressure with the squeeze involved on the bottom corner, right? Once I start getting towards the top, I ease off pressure, and then when I let go, again, I kind of like jellyfish away from it. Then I'm gonna come in, and after every pull, I usually compress the rim. You want the rim to be kind of thick and fat until you're finishing off the pot with like a drinking edge. The way I do that is basically just like a mini chair karate chop with my index and my forefinger here, and then this one just comes in on top, and that'll just compress it back into a strong shape. That looks much, much, much easier than it is, right? That's like, getting a pull like this is like a thing that will take you a long time to do. So like, don't be discouraged. Realistically, if you end up with like a couple pots that are pretty solid by the end of the class, like that's a good achievement, you know what I mean? This is a really hard thing to do, and people that are good at it make it look easy, and that makes it frustrating when you can't do it. So like, just be mindful that like, any progress is good progress. This is more about learning and hanging out and having fun and kind of treating yourself. Ceramics is one of those cool things where it's like, it's for you. You know what I mean? So that's great. And also you can make like Christmas presents for people, which is cool. Save yourself some money. So I do probably 2 of those muscle pulls, right, where I use the sponge. And again, I'm like adding water, and then I'm gonna remove water in just a second. I'm gonna squeeze those fingers together. And then I'm gonna rise up slowly as I do.
Is your index finger making full contact with the outside edge?
It's not adding pressure. My hands just kind of like lay like that, so it kind of just skates up it, right? If anything, a lot of my other fingers, and this is something I do subconsciously, they just kind of like back it up, but not with pressure. I'm trying to think of the best way to do it. They kind of just float there, but they're there to keep things from like wiggling around, right? So I'm gonna mop some of that water out. You can see I still have this big skirt. That's what I call this part here. You can try real hard to like force that into the clay to get it into height. I just find that to be more trouble than it's worth. So a lot of times I'll just like do what I can. So this is gonna be my 3rd muscle pull. This clay is already like pretty much at where it wants to be. I can tell it doesn't want to be. If you do like 1,000 little pulls, your clay gets kind of tired, right? So we want to get as much of it done as quickly as possible. That is like, don't like go Hulk mode and just like rip it up in one go, right? Not until you get comfortable. But this will yield you a cylinder shape. And then after I do a couple of those muscle pulls, I'll usually come in here and do what I call like dexterity pulls. That's when I stop using the sponge. And I'm just using my fingertips. We started with a cylinder, right? This is also the stage where I could go in and I can do any shaping, right? So that's a pretty decent cylinder, in my opinion.
Yes.
Make sure my inside is cleaned out real quick so that I don't have a bunch of water chilling there. Now, I still have a little bit of that skirt, right? Say you don't want a cylinder. Say you really wanted like a really rounded shape, or you want to put like some designs into it. What's up, James?
Can you explain what happens when we have too much water or too lots of water?
In the inside?
Yeah, just like what happens to the clay?
The clay gets basically, it's constantly absorbing water, so it's getting weaker and weaker and weaker. It's kind of like if you had foam or something, you know what I mean? And
If it's too dry, then
if it's too dry, it drags, and you'll get like some sort of like a skittering or jumping, and that'll throw the whole piece off, right?
Oh, okay.
So finding that like it's wet, you put water in, you do the thing you want to do, you get rid of all the water. That way it's not absorbing water, but you had enough moisture to do what you needed to do, right? So say you don't want a cylinder, right? Say I want to belly this out because I want like a different shaped mug. That's where your metal rib comes in handy. So what I'm going to do is, my inside finger placing some pressure. I'm basically just making a jig with my right hand. I'm shaping it into like a rounded shape like this. That's what's cool about the metal rib, is you can round stuff out with it. And I'm kind of just tracing along, like, so this is on the outside, this finger's on the inside. I'm kind of just tracing along this edge, trying to round that shape out a bit, right? Same thing, you can like push this in so that you end up with like a nice shape here. Like this is how you would make like one of those like kind of classic little vase shapes. You know what I mean? That's what your ribs are for. Your ribs are for shaping. I could have done this all with my fingers if I wanted to. These just happen to be super helpful, so I use them. Now say I don't like that shape. Decided I really want to go with something a little bit more modern, right? What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna wet this just a little bit. I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna straighten that back out with the wooden tool, or the wooden rib.
Is the straight edge against the clay?
Yep, straight edge is against the clay. You can still achieve like a rounded result with a wooden rib, which is why I use this tool more than any other tool. But if I wanted to make it more, I don't know, modern and if you just want to change the aesthetic, you know what I mean? Like where I then have straighter sides and then straighter sides and then have angles, you know what I mean? That's where your wooden tool really comes in handy. Does that make sense to everybody? These are just like your like finger extensions for shaping. Now you guys can see kind of what I did here. I cut off some of that skirt. This thing has a pointy edge, right? And that makes cutting off that skirt really easy. This thing's got a pointier edge. So I find that this one makes that step a little bit even easier. So what I'm gonna do, I know I have a bunch of clay in this corner here and I don't wanna trim this pot later. So what I'm gonna do, I usually do this at 3 o'clock, but I'm gonna do it at 6 o'clock just so you guys can see. I come in here with this like sort of, if this was a knife, it would be the sharp side, you know what I mean? I gouge in with very firm pressure, well, not firm, but like very even, steady pressure with my hands. And then like I said before, everything moves as one tool in unison. I basically cut a bunch of that clay off. Now, if I just try to scrape this off, it's real likely that that clay is going to jump from the wheel head straight back up onto my pot. A little trick to make that not happen is while the wheel's spinning, I basically angle my knife at the pot, and I feel that little well that I made there with water. Can you guys see that? This is a more advanced thing. You don't have to do any of this if you don't want, right? But this will help you not have to trim quite as much later. Now that that's filled with water, I can then cut in, and instead of going up my pot, it's going to go off my pot. Just trust me when I say like this will help you so much if you are trying to do this step and then you have clay that jumps up. I'm just going to do a little bit more shaping because I have a straight edge here. And mug. Yay. Another thing too, last little bit. If you have like a beer stein or something, it's cool if it has like a rounded edge, right? Because you want something really beefy. For anything I'm going to drink coffee out of or something that's like a little bit more dainty, or if I want a slightly better shape to the lip, you have corners of your mouth. A rounded edge doesn't fit into corners, so the likelihood of you dribbling is pretty high. This is weird to point to my mask when I say this because you can't see. But the way I get a drinking edge is I do that same compression like the mini chair karate chop like I talked to you guys about. But instead of coming in flat here, I come in slightly at an angle. And that'll yield me just a tiny bit of a sharper edge there that when you're drinking coffee out of, pay attention to the cups you have at home if you haven't done this. It makes a much more pleasant drinking experience having a drinking edge on the pot. So that's that.